When men talk about what they want, they often describe outcomes, success, stability, loyalty, attraction. But underneath those words, there is something more basic and far more human that rarely gets articulated: emotional safety. Not in the shallow, trendy sense of the phrase, but in a deep psychological way. The kind of safety that allows a person to exist without constantly managing the consequences of their honesty. Most men learn early that emotional expression comes with risk. They learn that certain feelings make them weaker in the eyes of others, that uncertainty is unattractive, that fear or confusion must be solved privately or not expressed at all. Over time, this conditioning doesn't just silence emotion, it restructures how men relate to intimacy. They don't stop feeling, they stop sharing, and eventually they stop expecting to be understood. So when a man looks for emotional safety in a woman, he is not looking for someone to fix him or endlessly reassure him. He is looking for a place where his inner life doesn't become ammunition, where his honesty doesn't later reappear during conflict as a character flaw, where vulnerability isn't met with panic, judgment, or escalation. This matters because intimacy is built on truth, and truth requires safety. If a man feels that expressing doubt will make him less respected, or that admitting weakness will destabilize the relationship, he will default to silence, not because he doesn't care, but because he's learned that silence is the cost of peace. Over time, this creates a quiet distance that neither partner fully understands. The relationship may still function, but something essential is missing. Emotional safety doesn't mean constant agreement. It doesn't mean suppressing your own needs or opinions. In fact, it requires the opposite: emotional maturity, the ability to tolerate discomfort without immediately reacting to it, the ability to listen without turning every confession into a crisis. When a man opens up, he's often testing a hypothesis, not making a demand. He's asking, consciously or not, is it safe to be real here? And the response to that question shapes everything that follows. If his honesty is met with curiosity rather than accusation, with calm rather than chaos, something shifts. He doesn't just feel understood, he feels respected. Respect is central here. Men don't separate emotional safety from respect the way we sometimes assume. For many men, being emotionally safe means being taken seriously, even in moments of uncertainty. This is where drama becomes corrosive, not because emotion is bad, but because unregulated emotion feels unpredictable. If every difficult conversation turns into an emotional storm, men learn to avoid those conversations altogether. They don't disengage because they don't care, they disengage because they're trying to preserve stability. Ironically, this avoidance is often misinterpreted as emotional unavailability, when in reality, it's a learned survival strategy. There's also a philosophical layer to this. Human beings are meaning-making creatures. We are constantly interpreting what our experiences say about who we are and what the world is like. When a man's vulnerability is punished, even subtly, he internalizes a narrative that his inner world is a liability, that intimacy requires performance rather than presence. Over time, this erodes not just the relationship, but his sense of self. Emotional safety interrupts that narrative. It communicates something profoundly stabilizing. You can be honest here, and the relationship will not collapse. You can admit you're unsure, and you will not be diminished. This doesn't make a man weaker. It makes him more grounded. It allows him to integrate parts of himself that were previously hidden or fragmented. And this integration matters. Psychologically, people who feel safe enough to be whole are more resilient, more consistent, and more capable of commitment. A man who doesn't have to guard his inner life is more present, more engaged, more willing to invest emotionally because the cost of doing so is no longer unbearable. This connects directly to the other things men want, but rarely articulate: respect, peace, loyalty. Emotional safety is the foundation that makes those possible. Without it, respect becomes conditional. Peace becomes avoidance. Loyalty becomes obligation rather than choice. It's important to clarify that emotional safety is not about never being challenged. Men don't want to be coddled, they want to be met. They want a partner who can disagree without humiliating, who can express hurt without attacking, who can set boundaries without threatening abandonment. This requires self-regulation, the ability to pause before reacting, to separate feeling from interpretation, to choose response over impulse. In that sense, Emotional safety is not something you give by being passive. It's something you create by being stable, by taking responsibility for your reactions instead of outsourcing them, by understanding that someone else's vulnerability is not a burden you must immediately resolve, but a moment you are being trusted with. Trust is the operative word here. When a man opens up, he is offering trust in its rawest form. He is temporarily suspending his defenses. What happens in that moment determines whether those defenses lower further or rise permanently. This is why small moments matter more than grand gestures. A dismissive comment, a sarcastic response, a tendency to bring up past admissions during arguments. These things accumulate. They teach a lesson even if no one intends them to. Conversely, a calm response, a willingness to listen without interruption, an acknowledgement that doesn't rush to judgment, these moments also accumulate. They build a sense of safety that is quiet but powerful. Over time, they change how a man shows up, not just in the relationship, but in life. There's also a cultural misunderstanding worth addressing. Emotional safety is often framed as something men should provide for women, and that's not wrong, but it's incomplete. Emotional safety is reciprocal, and men are far less likely to ask for it explicitly, not because they don't need it, but because they don't expect it. When they encounter it unexpectedly, it stands out. It feels rare. And rarity creates value. From a philosophical perspective, relationships are not just about attraction or compatibility. They are about orientation toward truth. A relationship that can tolerate truth even when it's uncomfortable is a relationship that can grow. One that will eventually fracture under the weight of unspoken realities. Emotional safety is what allows truth to surface without destroying the bond. It's what allows two imperfect people to evolve together rather than perform for each other. And for men, who are often socialized to equate worth with competence and control, this kind of safety is transformative. It allows them to stop pretending they have everything figured out. It allows them to be learners rather than performers. And paradoxically, this often makes them stronger, not weaker. A man who doesn't have to hide his uncertainty is more likely to confront it. A man who isn't shamed for his fears is more likely to overcome them. This is why emotional safety isn't just a nice to have. It's foundational. It shapes communication, conflict resolution, intimacy, and long-term commitment. Without it, relationships operate on scripts and assumptions. With it, they operate on reality. And here's the part that often gets overlooked. Emotional safety is not about changing men. It's about allowing them to be honest about who they already are and who they are becoming. That honesty is what makes genuine partnership possible. So if there's one thing to reflect on here, it's this. The way you respond to someone's vulnerability teaches them how safe it is to be real with you. That lesson doesn't just affect the moment. It shapes the entire relationship. Choose to respond with steadiness, and you don't just create connection, you create a space where growth becomes possible. After emotional safety, respect becomes the next quiet pillar holding everything together. And it's important to understand that respect for men is rarely about dominance or ego in the simplistic way it's often portrayed. It's far more subtle than that. Respect is communicated less through grand declarations and more through tone, timing, and behavior in moments that seem insignificant at first, but accumulate meaning over time. Men tend to experience respect as a form of recognition of effort, recognition of competence, recognition of intention. When that recognition is present, it reinforces a man's sense of orientation in the relationship. When it's absent, even unintentionally, it creates a low-grade erosion that eventually shows up as withdrawal, defensiveness, or resentment. One of the most misunderstood aspects of respect is that it isn't synonymous with agreement. A woman can disagree strongly with a man and still communicate deep respect. What matters is how the disagreement is expressed. Public correction, dismissive language, sarcasm, or eye-rolling might feel minor in the moment, but psychologically they signal something powerful, that his perspective's not worthy of serious engagement. Over time, this teaches a man that speaking up is risky, not because he fears conflict, but because he fears diminishment. Men are often socialized to derive a sense of worth from competence. This doesn't mean they want to be right all the time, but it does mean that being treated as capable matters deeply. When a man feels that his efforts are constantly second-guessed or minimized, he doesn't interpret that as concern, he interprets it as a lack of trust. And trust and respect are inseparable. There's also a relational asymmetry here that's worth acknowledging. Many men will tolerate a lack of verbal appreciation longer than they will tolerate a lack of respect. They may not articulate this clearly, but they feel it viscerally. Respect tells a man where he stands. Without it, the relationship becomes unstable because he no longer knows whether his contributions matter. This is why small moments are so revealing. How you speak about him to others, whether you interrupt or let him finish his thoughts, whether you assume good intent or default to criticism. These are not neutral behaviors, they are signals. And human beings, whether consciously or not, are always scanning for signals about their value. From a psychological perspective, respect functions as a regulator. It stabilizes emotional exchanges. When respect is present, difficult conversations can happen without escalating into power struggles. When it's absent, even minor disagreements feel threatening because they tap into a deeper fear of being dismissed or undermined. It's also important to distinguish respect from deference. Respect does not mean silencing yourself or shrinking your opinions. In fact, authentic respect requires strength. It requires the confidence to stand your ground without needing to belittle the other person. It requires the ability to say, "I disagree," without implying you're incompetent. That distinction is subtle, but it's everything. Philosophically, respect is tied to the idea of treating another person as an end in themselves, not merely as a means to emotional validation or security. When a man feels respected, he senses that he is being engaged with as a full agent, capable of thought and intention. He doesn't. He feels instrumentalized, useful only insofar as he fulfills certain roles. This has long-term consequences. A man who feels respected is more likely to take responsibility, to lead where appropriate, and to invest in the relationship's future. Not because he's asserting dominance, but because respect creates psychological safety around initiative. Without respect, initiative feels risky. Effort becomes conditional. Why try if it will be criticized or ignored? Respect also shows up in how conflict is handled. During disagreement, it's easy to reach for language that wounds because it feels effective in the moment. But words spoken in frustration have a way of outlasting the emotion that produced them. Men remember how they are spoken to when things are tense. Those moments often define the emotional memory of the relationship more than periods of harmony. There's a deeper layer here related to identity. Men often experience disrespect not just as relational friction, but as a threat to their sense of self. This doesn't mean they're fragile. It means that identity is shaped through interaction. When a man repeatedly encounters signals that his thoughts, efforts, or values are inconsequential, he internalizes that message, even if he doesn't consciously agree with it. Respect counters this by affirming agency. It says, "Your perspective matters, even when I don't share it." That affirmation is grounding. It allows a man to stay present rather than defensive. It allows him to listen rather than prepare counterarguments. Ironically, respect makes men more open to influence, not less. This ties directly into emotional safety. A man who feels emotionally safe but not respected will eventually close off. Safety without respect feels infantilizing. Respect without safety feels conditional. The two must coexist. Together, they create an environment where honesty and strength can exist simultaneously. There's also a cultural tension worth addressing. Modern relationships often emphasize equality, which is important, but equality is not sameness. Respect does not require erasing differences in how men and women experience the world. In fact, genuine respect often involves curiosity about those differences rather than denial of them. When respect is reduced to ideological performance, saying the right things rather than behaving in a grounded way, it loses its substance. Men are particularly sensitive to this. They tend to trust behavior over language. A respectful tone during disagreement will outweigh 100 verbal affirmations. Consistency matters more than intensity. Another overlooked aspect of respect is how it's expressed when a man is not present. Speaking about him with contempt, even jokingly, to friends or family erodes the relational bond. Men may not always hear these conversations, but they often sense the shift in attitude. Respect that disappears in private was never fully there to begin with. At a practical level, respect shows up as restraint. The restraint not to score points in an argument. The restraint not to expose vulnerabilities shared in confidence. the restraint to choose long-term trust over short-term emotional release. This kind of restraint is not suppression, it's discipline. And discipline is attractive because it signals maturity. From a philosophical standpoint, respect is what allows love to endure beyond emotion. Emotions fluctuate. Desire ebbs and flows. Respect provides continuity. It's what remains when feelings are strained and circumstances are difficult. Without it, relationships become reactive, governed by mood rather than principle. Men rarely ask for respect directly, not because they don't need it, but because asking for it feels paradoxical. Respect that has to be demanded is already compromised. Instead, men observe, they notice patterns, they draw conclusions quietly, and once a conclusion about respect is formed, it's difficult to reverse. This is why awareness matters. Respect is not something you switch on during serious conversations and forget in daily life. It's communicated continuously, often unconsciously. The good news is that it's also something you can cultivate deliberately, by paying attention to tone, by slowing down responses, by choosing language that critiques ideas rather than character. When respect is present, men feel anchored. They know where they stand. They feel invited into partnership rather than positioned as an opponent. This doesn't eliminate conflict, but it changes its nature. Conflict becomes a problem to solve together, not a battle to win. And that brings us to the deeper point. Respect is not about making a man feel superior. It's about making him feel significant. There's a profound difference. Significance says, you matter here. Superiority says, you're above me. The first creates connection. The second creates imbalance. If there is a single insight to take away from this, it's this. The way you speak to someone, especially when you're frustrated, teaches them how valued they are in your life. Choose words that preserve dignity, and you don't just maintain respect, you build a relationship strong enough to weather tension without breaking. After emotional safety and respect, something quieter, but just as powerful comes into focus. A woman who is at peace with herself, not flawless, not endlessly positive, but internally regulated, grounded, responsible for her own emotional state. This quality is rarely named, but it's felt immediately, and it shapes the entire emotional climate of a relationship. Men are deeply affected by the emotional environment they live in. Whether they consciously acknowledge it or not, they respond to the level of stability around them. A woman who is at war with herself brings that war into the relationship. A woman who has made peace with herself brings calm, not through silence or suppression, but through coherence. This is not about being emotionally distant or low maintenance. It's about emotional ownership, the ability to experience emotion without outsourcing responsibility for it. When a woman can say, I'm upset and I'm going to take a moment to understand why, instead of, I'm upset and you need to fix this right now, something important shifts. The man is no longer positioned as a regulator of her inner world. He becomes a partner, not a stabilizer. Psychologically, this matters because men are often conditioned to solve problems. When faced with emotional distress they didn't cause and can't resolve, many men experience a sense of inadequacy or helplessness. Over time, this creates pressure to manage, to anticipate, to avoid triggering reactions. Eventually, that pressure turns into withdrawal, not because the man doesn't care, but because he's exhausted by a role he never consented to play. A woman at peace with herself doesn't eliminate emotional intensity. She contextualizes it. She understands that feelings are information, not commands. This distinction is subtle but foundational. When feelings are treated as commands, relationships become reactive. When they're treated as information, relationships become reflective. There's also a philosophical dimension here related to agency. To be at peace with oneself is to accept responsibility for one's internal life. It's to recognize that while we can be influenced by others, we are not controlled by them. This orientation is deeply attractive because it signals maturity. It says, I am not asking you to carry what is mine to understand. Men sense this immediately. They feel the difference between being with someone who is emotionally self-aware and someone who is emotionally dependent. The former invites closeness, the latter demands regulation. Over time, demand erodes desire, while invitation deepens it. It's also worth addressing a common misunderstanding. Being at peace with yourself does not mean being passive or endlessly agreeable. In fact, it often means the opposite. It means having the clarity to express needs without emotional volatility, to set boundaries without threats, to articulate dissatisfaction without character assassination. From a psychological standpoint, emotional regulation is one of the strongest predictors of relationship satisfaction. People who can tolerate discomfort without impulsive reaction create relational safety. They don't escalate unnecessarily. They don't catastrophize. They don't turn temporary feelings into permanent narratives. Men, in particular, are drawn to this because it creates predictability, not boredom, predictability, in the sense of emotional reliability. They know that conflict won't spiral into chaos. They know that disagreement won't result in emotional punishment. That knowledge allows them to relax, and relaxation is a prerequisite for intimacy. There's also a deeper identity component at play. Men often define themselves through responsibility. When they are constantly managing someone else's emotional state, that responsibility becomes distorted. It shifts from purposeful contribution to emotional containment. This is unsustainable. Over time, it breeds resentment, even if the man never consciously names it. A woman at peace with herself interrupts this dynamic. She allows the man to contribute without bay. NG consumed. She creates space for mutual support rather than unilateral regulation. This balance is what allows relationships to grow rather than stagnate. Philosophically, inner peace reflects alignment between values, actions, and emotions. It doesn't mean life is easy, it means reactions are proportionate. This proportionality is crucial. When responses consistently exceed the situation, trust erodes. People begin to walk on eggshells. Authenticity diminishes. Men are particularly sensitive to this because they tend to associate emotional volatility with instability, not danger in the dramatic sense, but unpredictability in the relational sense. If emotional responses feel random or disproportionate, men learn to disengage as a form of self-protection. This doesn't mean men can't handle emotion. It means they struggle with incoherence. Emotion that makes sense, that is communicated clearly and owned responsibly, is far easier to engage with than emotion that is explosive or displaced. There's also an important developmental aspect. A woman who has done the work of understanding herself, her triggers, her patterns, her unresolved conflicts, brings that self-knowledge into the relationship. She doesn't expect her partner to intuit her needs without communication. She doesn't punish him for failing unspoken tests. This clarity is rare, and rarity creates value. From a relational perspective, inner peace is contagious, not because it suppresses conflict, but because it EL's regulation. It sets a tone. It slows things down. It makes space for thought. Over time, this tone influences how both partners respond to stress, disappointment, and uncertainty. This connects directly to loyalty and long-term commitment. Men are more likely to commit deeply to relationships that feel emotionally sustainable. Passion may ignite attraction, but peace sustains it. A man can weather external stress if the relationship feels like a refuge rather than another source of pressure. It's also worth noting that inner peace is not something you perform. Men are remarkably attuned to authenticity. They can sense when calm is performative, when emotional restraint is actually suppression. True peace is flexible. It allows for anger, sadness, joy, and fear without being dominated by any of them. At a practical level, being at peace with yourself shows up in how you handle disappointment. Do you reflect before reacting? Do you take responsibility for your interpretations? Do you allow space for repair rather than demanding immediate resolution? These behaviors signal emotional maturity far more than any declaration ever could. There's a philosophical humility in this as well. To be at peace with yourself is to accept that you are a work in progress, that you will sometimes be wrong, that growth requires discomfort. This humility makes relationships collaborative rather than adversarial. Men respond to this because it removes the pressure to be perfect. When a woman is grounded in her own self-understanding, she doesn't require perfection from her partner to feel secure. She allows him to be human, and that allowance often brings out his best qualities. Ultimately, a woman at peace with herself offers something rare: emotional steadiness without emotional distance, strength without rigidity, presence without pressure. This combination creates a relationship environment where both people can grow rather than merely cope. And here is the reflection worth sitting with. The more responsibility you take for your inner world, the less you need to control the outer one. Inner peace doesn't just change how you feel, it changes how others experience being with you. And that change is often the difference between a relationship that survives and one that truly thrives. When emotional safety is present, respect is established, and inner peace becomes part of the relational atmosphere, something deeper begins to matter: loyalty. But not loyalty as obligation, fear, or control. What men secretly want is loyalty that feels chosen, not enforced. Loyalty that emerges from conviction rather than surveillance. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Many people think of loyalty as a rule set: what you can or can't do, who you can or can't talk to, how much reassurance must be given. But men experience loyalty less as compliance and more as orientation. It's not about being watched, it's about knowing where someone stands when things become inconvenient, unglamorous, or uncertain. Psychologically, loyalty functions as an anchor. It tells a man that the emotional investment he is making is not temporary or conditional on constant performance. Without this anchor, even strong attraction feels unstable. A man may enjoy the connection, but he will hesitate to fully commit if he senses that loyalty is dependent on circumstances staying easy. This is why jealousy and control often backfire. They attempt to manufacture loyalty through pressure, but pressure produces resistance, not devotion. Men don't feel chosen when they're monitored. They feel managed, and management undermines the very thing it seeks to secure. True loyalty communicates something far more powerful: I am here because I want to be. That message allows a man to relax into the relationship rather than constantly proving his worth. Relaxation, again, is not laziness, it's psychological safety. It's what allows a man to invest deeply without keeping one foot out the door. There's also a philosophical dimension to loyalty that's often ignored. Loyalty is a voluntary limitation. It's the choice to narrow options in service of something meaningful. Men understand this intuitively. They make these kinds of choices in work, in craft, in long-term goals. When a woman shows that she chooses loyalty freely, it resonates with a man's sense of purpose. But loyalty isn't just about sexual exclusivity or external behavior. It's also emotional. It's about how a woman positions herself in moments of tension. Does she turn toward her partner or away from him when things are difficult? Does she seek understanding or validation from outsiders before attempting resolution within the relationship? Men are acutely sensitive to this, not because they want isolation, but because emotional alignment matters. When conflict arises, a man wants to know that his partner is fundamentally on his side, even if she disagrees with him. Loyalty doesn't mean blind agreement, it means shared orientation toward resolution rather than exposure. This connects directly to trust. Trust is not built by reassurance alone, it's built by consistency over time. When a woman repeatedly demonstrates that she chooses the relationship, especially when doing so requires effort or restraint, trust deepens. And with trust comes commitment. There's also an existential element here. Men often experience love as a decision reinforced by action. When loyalty feels conditional, dependent on mood, convenience, or external approval, it destabilizes that decision. A man may stay, but he will not fully integrate the relationship into his long-term vision. Loyalty that feels chosen allows him to do that integration. It allows him to plan, to invest, to see the relationship not as a variable, but as a constant. This is profoundly stabilizing, especially in a world that feels increasingly uncertain. It's also important to address the difference between loyalty and attachment. Insecurity. Loyalty does not require constant proof. In fact, constant proof erodes its meaning. Men don't want to be repeatedly tested. They want to be trusted until trust is violated. This baseline trust is a gift, and gifts tend to be protected rather than exploited when they're given freely. From a psychological standpoint, secure attachment is built on the expectation of availability, not the enforcement of proximity. A woman who is loyal because she wants to be, not because she's afraid of losing the relationship, signals security. Security is deeply attractive because it reduces emotional noise. Men also pay attention to how loyalty is expressed in language. Does a woman speak about we and us naturally or only when it's convenient? Does she protect the dignity of the relationship in public spaces? These things matter more than dramatic declarations. There's a paradox here. The more a woman tries to control loyalty, the less it feels real. The less she tries to control it, the more powerful it becomes. Chosen loyalty is quiet. It doesn't announce itself constantly. It shows up in consistency, restraint, and alignment. This restraint is particularly important. Loyalty often requires not acting on every impulse. Not every attraction needs to be explored. Not every frustration needs to be aired publicly. This isn't repression, it's prioritization. It's choosing the long-term health of the relationship over short-term emotional discharge. Men understand this kind of discipline because they apply it in other areas of life. When they see it mirrored in a relationship, it creates respect and admiration. It signals that the relationship is being treated as something valuable, something worth protecting. There's also a moral component. Loyalty reflects character. It reveals how someone behaves when no one is watching, when there's nothing immediate to gain. Men are often assessing this quietly. They're asking themselves, if things get hard, will this person stay oriented toward us or will she seek escape? The answer to that question determines how much risk a man is willing to take emotionally. Deep commitment requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires trust. Loyalty that feels chosen reduces the perceived risk of vulnerability. This also ties back to inner peace. A woman who is secure within herself doesn't use loyalty as a bargaining chip. She doesn't threaten departure to gain leverage. She doesn't withhold commitment to maintain power. Her loyalty is stable because it's grounded in self-respect rather than fear. From a philosophical lens, loyalty is an expression of values enacted over time. It's not a feeling, it's a practice. And practices shape identity. When a woman practices loyalty, she becomes someone who is loyal. That identity is felt, not just observed. Men respond to this because it simplifies their internal calculus. They don't have to constantly assess where they stand. They can ECT energy outward toward building, protecting, and providing because the relational foundation feels secure. It's also worth noting that loyalty includes loyalty during growth. People change. Relationships evolve. Chosen loyalty adapts rather than resists. It allows space for development without interpreting change as betrayal. This flexibility is crucial for long-term relationships. Ultimately, loyalty that feels chosen communicates one essential message: you are not provisional. And few things are more motivating than knowing you are not easily replaced, not constantly evaluated, not perpetually at risk. So here is the reflection to carry forward. Loyalty is most powerful when it is freely given and quietly maintained. When you choose someone consistently, without coercion or performance, you don't just secure a relationship, you create a foundation strong enough to support a shared future.